Before viewing video lessons, it is important to read the textbook using the learning guide as your turn-by-turn directions. Then use the learning guide to take organized notes in your own words with examples and pictures. Chapter 1, Psychology's Early History, Part 2. The history of psychology involves trying to determine what and how we should study psychology. These are the 10 historical schools of psychology. In this video lesson, we will be discussing the first 5. We are going to continue learning objective 1.1. Wilhelm Wundt founded psychology in 1879. Then it spread all over the world, but particularly in the US. The first school of psychology was called Structuralism. Structuralism built on the work of Wilhelm Wundt, but was led in the US by someone named Edward Titchener. Wundt and Titchener said that psychology should study the consciousness, and they thought that we should focus on the basic elements of consciousness. So they wanted to take this thing called consciousness and divide it down into its most basic pieces and parts. This is similar to trying to understand the biology of a person by understanding the workings of an individual cell, or in the case of the physical world, the workings of an individual atom or the structure of the different elements. So this theme in science continued in psychology of analyzing into the most basic elements. For Titchener and Wundt, the very most basic elements are your 5 senses. So what you see, smell, hear, taste, and touch. Those are the most basic elements of your conscious experience. The technique used to study consciousness was called introspection. This was usually done with just one person, most often the researcher themselves. So Edward Titchener would go into his laboratory and he would spend all day studying just himself. The way he would introspect is he would make careful, systematic observations of his own conscious experience. This involved exposing himself to stimuli, such as a piece of clay or a rubber ball. And he would manipulate that stimulus, all the while writing down what he heard, smelled, tasted, and touched. Now, at the same time that structuralism was trying to define psychology one way, shortly after, functionalism decided to focus in a slightly different direction. Functionalism was led by a man named William James, and he believed that instead of looking at the little bits and pieces of consciousness, he thought we should focus on the big picture, the forest instead of the trees. So he looked at the function of consciousness. What does it do? What does this awareness do? And the way that he studied consciousness was with testing large groups. So he created the field of mental testing, which today we call psychometrics. He would get large groups of people together and he would give them all the same test, and then he would try to figure out why some people were different from others. He also encouraged research in developmental patterns, so how we develop and change over time. He also looked into sex differences or differences between men and women. These two schools of psychology sort of battled it out in the early history of psychology, trying to decide if we were going to focus on the structure of consciousness or the function of consciousness. Then a new kid came to town. His name was Sigmund Freud, and he founded the psychoanalytic school. The first thing you should know about Sigmund Freud is he was not a psychologist. So he was an outsider to this world of psychology, trying to figure out how to use science. He was actually a physician in Austria. So the hotbed of psychology was in the US. He was outside the field, but also outside the country. And Sigmund Freud tried to figure out what was going on with some of his patients. And through this process of trying to figure out what was going on with his patients, he decided that unconscious processes and conflicts were influencing their behavior. Now, the word unconscious means outside awareness. And so he said that what drove our behavior were things that we were not aware of. And he thought that down in this sort of deep, hidden, unconscious, unaware part of ourselves, there was conflicts or a raging battle going on. He said that these conflicts arose from our childhood experiences. So things that happened to us as a kid stuck with us for the rest of our lives. He also said that these conflicts centered on sex and or aggression. Now, it's important to note that Sigmund Freud did not define sex exactly the way we would today. He defined anything pleasurable as sexual. So he would define things like eating or even relieving one's own bowels as sexual experiences. So if you can sort of sub out the word sex with pleasurable or enjoyable, then that would be how he used that word. Well, Sigmund Freud's ideas were very controversial. The world of psychology initially dismissed him as a quack. He has nothing to do with us. We're doing science. We are systematically observing and analyzing. And he says that things we can't even see are responsible for behavior. So they just dismissed him outright. But his ideas inspired the public. When the public got a hold of his ideas, they found them to make some sense, and they were a little bit scandalous, which always makes for good press. If you think about it, he was kind of like the 50 Shades of Grey of his time. Everybody was talking about him, but it was kind of a hush-hush thing. So psychology eventually had to react to Sigmund Freud, and boy, did they ever react. The biggest reaction began with a man named John B. Watson. He was a psychologist in the United States, and he had very specific ideas for what psychology was, what it should and shouldn't study, what belonged in the world of psychology and did not. So he founded the school of behaviorism. Behaviorism said that we should scientifically study behavior only. The unconscious has no place in the study of behavior. In fact, consciousness has no place in the study of behavior. He defined behavior as only those things that you can see. So while you're taking notes, I can see your pencil wiggling. I can see you writing down certain things. I can observe that behavior. What I can't see are your thoughts about writing your notes down. So behaviorism doesn't care what you think. I cannot see from the outside how you feel about taking those notes. And so I don't care about feelings. Behaviorism only cares about what can be seen. And what can impact or change that behavior, but of course those impacts must also be observable. So he looked at the impact of observable events on observable behaviors. This resulted in a radical reorientation of psychology away from consciousness. So behaviorism rejected all of the three previous schools. So John B. Watson started this movement, but it became more refined underneath someone named B.F. Skinner. B.F. Skinner was another psychologist in the United States, and he did thousands upon thousands of research studies. And what he focused on were the exact environmental factors that determine behavior. Two big principles of behaviorism under Skinner are that responses that lead to pleasant outcomes are repeated, and responses that lead to unpleasant outcomes are not repeated. Think about that for just 1 minute. Not really groundbreaking stuff, but he studied it in a scientific way. So he, for example, might study how giving you a Hershey's Kiss every time you take a page of notes could change your note-taking. If you like chocolate, what Skinner's theory says is your note-taking will increase. You'll do more and more notes. If you engage in a behavior and something unpleasant happens, so if you're talking in class to another student and the teacher writes your name on the board like you were in elementary school and takes away one of your lucky bucks or changes the color of your light, then that's an unpleasant thing, and we would expect that behavior to decrease. You would stop talking. So behaviorism had very clear ideas about the environment impacting our behavior. And Skinner famously wrote a book called Beyond Freedom and Dignity, where he basically said, we have no free will. We are essentially mindless robots that just react to environmental stimuli. Kind of like those robotic vacuum cleaners that when they hit the wall, they turn around and go the other direction. So, we have structuralists, functionalists, psychoanalytic, and behaviorism. The last of the early schools of psychology emerged basically from a group that complained that psychoanalytic theory and behaviorism were both dehumanizing. They thought that they both took the humanity out of people. And so this new school of thought was loosely referred to as Humanism. Humanism has two key figures, Carl Rogers, who is pictured, and Abraham Maslow. And they shared a few aspects of their theories. They basically said that people are different from animals. You cannot do studies on animals and compare them to people. Behaviorists did a lot of studies on animals. They also had a very optimistic view of what drove human behavior. They said that we were driven by, first off, free will or personal choice, and we're also driven by something called personal growth, which was the desire to be a better person, that we sometimes made mistakes along the way, but the underlying driving force isn't some sort of weird sexual hang-up from my childhood, but it's my desire to be the best me I can possibly be. So the historical schools of psychology that were established early on were structuralism, functionalism, psychoanalytic, behaviorism, and humanism. In another video, we'll cover the modern 5 schools.